Well, good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Cynthia Chow, and I'm the director for the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies at the University of Iowa. And the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, together with the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, thank you for joining us for this special webinar, Islamic Feminism and Women's Rights, to mark International Women's Day. All around the world, International Women's Day is celebrated annually on the 8th of March, and there has been much media coverage about Muslim women's status in South Asia, the Middle East, and the Western world. But voices from Southeast Asia are so much less heard from, yet the world's largest Muslim population in the world resides in Southeast Asia. We are thus very honored to have two speakers from Southeast Asia, namely Vivian Wee and Rosanna Issa from Singapore and from Malaysia. And our first speaker will be Vivian Wee. And Vivian Wee obtained her PhD in anthropology from the Australian National University. And she's currently teaching at Singapore University of Social Sciences. Her decades-long field research has been conducted with Muslims in the Riau Lingga Islands of Indonesia. And in Singapore, she's a founder member of the Association of Women for Action and Research, or AWARE in short. And she's currently senior advisor there. From 2013 to 2016, she led the project Gender Equality is Our Culture, which was supported by United Nations Women and implemented among Muslims in Singapore and Indonesia. She is an active member of the Institute for Women's Empowerment, a regional organization for gender equality. In that capacity, from 2006 to 2019, she was involved in several multi-country programs with organizations in China, Indonesia, Pakistan, as well as countries in the Middle East and Africa. In addition, she has had extensive discussions with leading teachers of Islam in Indonesia. Our second speaker will be Rosanna Issa. And Rosanna Issa is the Executive Director for Sisters in Islam, a Malaysian NGO working on women's rights within the framework of Islam. She joined the Malaysian women's rights movement in 1999 to address violence against women. And this exposed her to the challenges women face to have their rights recognized and exercised in the context of Islamization within a democratic nation with parallel legal systems. While gender, ethnic, and religious diversities are celebrated in society, they are negated at different levels of policies and laws. Before taking up the Sisters in Islam helm, Rosanna Issa worked with several national, regional, and international women's rights organizations. This special event has been made possible only because of the invaluable partnership of numerous colleges, faculties, departments, centers, and programs across the University of Iowa, as well as support from community collaborators. And they are hereby gratefully acknowledged by name in alphabetical order. We thank our co-sponsors, UI Center for Human Rights, the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Religious Studies, UI International Programs, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, International Studies Program, and the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. We also thank our collaborators, the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, the Asian Pacific American Cultural Center, and the Center for Language and Culture Learning. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this webinar, Onyecha Oche, who is a board member of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, and her work in pharmacy, healthcare administration, and health services research has taken her across continents from Nigeria to Iowa City. And she is currently a PhD candidate and research assistant at the College of Pharmacy at the University of Iowa. So may I pass the baton on to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Good evening, everyone. My name is Onyeche Oche, and I will be serving as moderator for today's webinar. As we get started, I would like to cover some webinar etiquette tips. Members of the audience, we kindly request that you turn off your audio and video functions to avoid any background noise and distractions. Following the speaker's presentations, we will have a 15 to 20-minute Q&A session. As the speakers deliver their presentations, we invite you to submit your questions via the chat function, which is at the bottom of this screen. As moderator for the Q&A session, I will then pose your questions to the speakers at the end of the presentations. At this point, please join me in welcoming Vivian Wee, founder member of the Association of Women for Action and Research in Singapore, who will be our first speaker for today.
Thank you, Onyeche. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending this discussion. Some of you who are here may be Muslims. Some of you may not be. I am not Muslim myself. I grew up in a Chinese Buddhist environment. I'd like to share my screen with you now. Okay, oops, yes. Just give me a minute to. So we have today, oops, sorry. Okay, we have today a webinar on on international feminism and women's rights. So my talk is entitled Women's Rights in Islam, Islamism, and CEDAW. So today we have this title, Islamic Feminism. This title evokes some questions. We may ask, for instance, whether Islam is for or against women's rights. Or we may ask whether the term Islamic feminism contradicts Islam and whether there is room in Islam for feminism. Speaking from personal experience, in 44 years of field research and social interactions with Muslims in Indonesia, in the Riau Lingga Islands, as mentioned by Cynthia, and in Jakarta and many other places in Indonesia, I have not encountered Indonesian Muslims who tried to limit my mobility or cast doubt on my capacity as a woman. Nobody ever asked me why I, as a lone woman, was traveling by herself. I was often the only non-Muslim in the whole Muslim community. When I did field research, I depended on the hospitality of the Muslim community where I wanted to stay and work. In all that time, I always met with kindness and hospitality. Stories were told to me about strong women who established villages, carried out raids, and fought pirates. Oops, how do I go down? Oh. But now we are reading about the Taliban in Afghanistan who are preventing girls and women from being educated, from working, and from going out by themselves. Is this Islam? Such misogyny is being justified in the name of Islam. So we must address this question: is misogyny part of Islam? In the Quran, Prophet Muhammad addressed male and female Muslims equally because both of them have the same religious duties. The 5 pillars of Islam apply to both of them. Both must profess their faith in God. Both must pray 5 times a day. Both must give charity to the poor. Both must fast during the fasting month. And both should make the pilgrimage to Mecca if they can afford it. The Quran does not state anywhere that a female Muslim is lower than a male Muslim. In fact, the Quran states explicitly, men and women are equal before God. Now, Prophet Muhammad lived during the 7th century. His first wife was Khadija, who was older than him and who was his boss. She owned the caravan that Muhammad helped to manage. Muhammad and Khadija were married for 25 years until she died when he was 50. Now, Prophet Muhammad's life may be divided in two periods. The first period was in the city of Mecca, where he lived from 570 to 622. The second period was very short. The second period was in Medina, where he lived from 1622 until he died in 632, 10 years. And he went because of persecution in pagan Mecca. When he lived in Medina for the last 10 years of his life, men and women prayed together side by side. And in the last 10 years of his life, he married 9 women, 8 being widows, divorcees, or captives due to war with pagan Mecca. 2 were from powerful clans whose leaders succeeded Muhammad as caliphs. After he died in 656, widow Aisha fought on a camel with Ali, the 4th caliph, who was also Muhammad's son-in-law. So we know from these examples that 7th century women could own businesses like Khadija and fight battles even if they were riding camels like Aisha. So Muslim feminists now throughout the world want to return to Prophet Muhammad's vision of an egalitarian religion for an equal society. After Muhammad died, there were disputes among Muslims about who should succeed him as leader of Muslims. These disputes led to a split around the year 661 between 2 groups of Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, who now comprise 85 to 90% of Muslims in the world, versus the Shia Muslims, who comprise 10 to 15% of Muslims in the world. Conflict between the 2 groups continues to this day. Iran is the main follower of Shia Islam. However, we should realize that for almost 14 centuries, Iran was not run by the clergy. The present-day Islamic Republic of Iran adheres to a concept that was invented by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1970, and that is that the religious cleric is the supreme leader of the country. So what we see in the news today of oppression of Iranian women in present-day Iran, this is actually derived from a 1970 concept. The tendency of splitting off occurred frequently in the long history of Islam. Now, in the 1700s is 1,000 years after Prophet Muhammad, two men founded 2 Muslim sects. The first man was Muhammad Abdul Wahab. He founded the Wahhabi sect, also known as the Salafi sect. The second man was Shah Waliullah. His teachings led to the 19th century religious institute at Deoband, which is a town in North India. And hence, the people who graduate from this religious institute are known as the Deobandis. Now, it is a common mistake that we find that people misunderstand these sectarian interpretations as Islam. These are called Islamism or political Islam. So they are ideologies that extract and interpret verses of the Quran and Hadith for political objectives. Examples of the followers of the Wahhabi or Salafi sect would be the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Al-Qaeda, and other countries. I should have made a stop here. Sorry. Al-Qaeda is a separate organization. They are not associated with Muslim Brotherhood. And there is ISIL or ISIS, which practices a great deal of violence, and we also read about them in the news. They are followers of the Wahhabi or Salafi sect. And then there is the Saud dynasty in Saudi Arabia. We also read in the news about women being allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, for instance. They are followers of the Salafi sect. Now we have one major follower of the 19th century Deobandi sect. They are the Taliban in Afghanistan. So when we read about this discrimination against women in Afghanistan, they are examples of the Deobandi sect. They are not examples of Islam. So what we have here is that it's a clash between equality and misogyny. Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century envisioned Islam as an egalitarian religion, but misogyny is in Islamism. So let me give you some examples of the kind of misogyny that we find. In the Islamic Republic of Iran, misogyny is in the law. And in the 1979 constitution, women are defined as mothers. The Iranian penal code enables men to discipline women and girls. Fathers can kill daughters. In some provinces, 20% of all murders are committed by fathers killing daughters. There is no such law in the Quran that a father can kill a daughter. In Saudi Arabia, at least 1,000 women leave their country yearly because of gender discrimination. They are subject to their male guardians' control throughout their lives. Their male guardian may be their father, husband, or other male relative. And these male guardians must give permission for the women to leave their house, to go to school, to get a job, or do anything at all. Women are discriminated against in marriage, family, and divorce. Activists for women's rights activists are suppressed. At present, the government of Saudi Arabia is codifying laws that were previously individual men's discretionary acts. On 8th of March 2022, Saudi Arabia passed its first personal status law. But this only codified many informal problematic practices and entrenched a system of gender discrimination that is prevalent throughout a woman's life. Male guardianship was not eliminated. The Taliban in Afghanistan, we read about them, they have barred women and girls from secondary and university education, and from gyms and parks. They ban women workers, they prevent women from traveling by themselves, and so on. In other words, women are barred from the public sphere. Now, this is actually an example of Deobandi misogyny. And to find an example, we only have to look at one of the most revered leaders of the Deobandis, Ashraf Ali Tanvi, who wrote about Muslim marriage as a hierarchy of men above women, husbands over wives, Arab Muslims over non-Arab Muslims, upper caste Muslims over lower caste Muslims. He said male guardians can decide on their female wards marriage before puberty, even without their consent. they should ensure that women do not marry men of a lower caste. He wrote, quote, you should continue teaching your women folk and inculcate respect and good manners in them. Do not allow them to become impudent and disrespectful. The intellect of women is deficient, unquote. Now, here's a view of women as inferior beings is alien to Prophet Muhammad's Islam. I now want to talk about patriarchal societies. So what we have is a situation where patriarchy in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and India is justified as Islam, even though misogyny contravenes Prophet Muhammad's Islam. Now, to see how this works, we can look at a paper that was written in 2012 by these authors, Inaya Rominaya and Mark Woodward. And their paper is titled Wahhabi Perspectives on Pluralism and Gender, a Saudi-Indonesian contrast. They found that the Indonesian school that they investigated had practices that differed from those of Saudi Wahhabism. The Indonesian school was diverse in ritual practice. They had interactions with other Muslims and non-Muslims, and they thought that the state does not have the right to endorse any religion or any interpretation of Islam. So they advocated a separation of state and religion, and they did not define gender segregation as part of moral order. These different practices derive from different social contexts. So I think that Indonesia is a much less patriarchal society than Saudi Arabian society is. So what we have is women asserting their rights to be social equals in every way, contrary to patriarchal dictates, even if these patriarchal dictates are justified in the name of Islam. Islamic feminism draws its content from the Quran and Islamic history since the 7th century. But I would like to end my talk by highlighting that there is a need for Islamic feminism to engage with current discussions on human rights and women's rights. Why? Because the countries where patriarchy is justified as Islam are member states of the UN. Upon joining the UN, member states agree to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Women's rights are part of human rights. Most important is the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which we shorten as CEDAW. Now, let's look at those three countries that I mentioned. Afghanistan signed CEDAW in 1980, ratifying in 2003. As I know, the Afghan government has not written to the UN to withdraw from CEDAW or to withdraw from the UN. So therefore, by joining the UN, they agreed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Saudi Arabia has signed and ratified CEDAW in 2000. Iran has neither signed nor ratified CEDAW. Now, what ratification means is that it legally binds a country to submit national reports every 4 years on what has been done. These national reports are submitted to the UN. So women's rights are known to the countries that have ratified CEDAW, including Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. They cannot say that, they cannot plead ignorance. So what we have is the UN as an international monitoring system on women's rights and human rights for countries who have joined as member states. And I think Prophet Muhammad, who lived almost 1,400 years ago, would have approved of the women's rights recognized in CEDAW. That's all I have to say in this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian Wee. Please join me in welcoming Rosanna Issa, Executive Director for Sisters in Islam in Malaysia.
Rosanna, you're muted.
This happens all the time. Hello, everyone. I'm not able to see you, but I hope you are tuning in and listening in. Thank you very much, Oniche, for the introduction, and also to longtime friend Vivian for that really very, very comprehensive overview. You know, like 1,400 years of history of Islam and background of Islam compressed into 15 minutes, and that was really very, very well done. Thanks a lot, Vivian. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and I hope somebody can maybe give me a shout out on mic that you are able to see it.
Can see it.
All right, great, thank you. So firstly, of course, thank you very much to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council and the University of Iowa Center for Asian and Pacific Studies for organizing and for having me here to speak with all of you today. So maybe let me start with the group Sisters in Islam. I'm speaking on behalf, representing Sisters in Islam. We are a group, a women's group, and I would say a feminist rights-based group based in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia. We've been around for, you know, arguably about 35 years, because there are kind of like three, you know, dates or years that we have in terms of, you know, how, you know, we started organizing ourselves, and then how we came out to the public, and then after that another date where we have registered ourselves formally as an organization. I am, you know, I consider myself like the second generation sisters. I am not a part of the founding members of Sisters that comprise 8 women from all kinds of different backgrounds. And essentially they came together because some of them were journalists, and they had been assigned to cover cases in Sharia courts at that time. And they were, and women who went to court were essentially sharing with the journalists, saying, you know, I expected to get justice in the Sharia courts, but there's so much biasness, you know, in terms of the views of the judges, in terms of the processes and how we are being treated by the staff in the courts. And so they feel that, you know, they have gone through this hardship in terms of their marriage, and they are expecting to get some kind of justice in their quest for either divorce or to get maintenance for themselves or for their children and so on. But they're not getting the justice that they are expecting. And this basically gave rise to the questions raised by the founding members of Sisters in Islam. Now, if God is just, if Islam is just, then why do laws made in the name of Islam lead to injustice for Muslim women? And Vivian had already mentioned to us that in the Quran, you know, there is a verse that states that, you know, women, both women and men, are equal in the eyes of God. So if that is the case, though, when it comes to the laws and policies, why is it women are unequal in the eyes of men? And so really this is the quest that we've, Sisters in Islam had embarked on from since 30 or more years ago. And so here I'm just going to briefly, you know, share with you about Sisters in Islam, why we do what we do, and essentially it's, you know, trying to answer those questions or get to the analysis of the questions that we had raised before, and how is it that we're addressing why we do what we do, and what are we doing, and I've described a little bit of who we are. So just to give you a kind of context in terms of the 1980s, when Sisters in Islam had emerged. At that time, discrimination against women in law and practice was ongoing. We had actually one of the best Islamic family laws in the world that was enacted in 1984. But there was also this whole movement, to have Malaysia, at the political level, that there is an Islamist party that has its view to have Malaysia become an Islamic state. And one of the ways to manifest that Malaysia is an Islamic state is to have hudud laws implemented in Malaysia. So there is really a lot of resistance. I mean, there was a political project by that political party to realize this Islamic state through the enactment of the hudud laws. And therefore, Sisters in Islam was kind of also there to kind of do a check-in in terms of, if you're pushing for this, then what does this mean in terms of women's rights? How are these laws going to impact on women? And the work that we do, the reform that we demand is in terms of saying that Islam recognizes equality and justice for women, but those groups or those political parties says that they see our demands as going against God. It was also around that time that I think globally there's a very vibrant campaign around the issue of violence against women, which is still ongoing until today. And Malaysia was at the crux of pushing for the enactment of the Domestic Violence Act. And it was very, very interesting because we had a religious authority called the Islamic Center at that time that said, oh, you can have this domestic violence law for non-Muslim women, but you cannot have it for Muslim women because in Islam, men or husbands can beat their wives. And therefore, this is also one of the impetus for the founding members to come together really to understand why or what does the Quran actually say about women's rights. So Sisters in Islam, essentially, the founding members came together, studied for 3 years. They held study sessions every week on Monday nights after work. They had gathered at one of the houses of the members and studied the meaning of the Quran, particularly taking the approach of reading the Quran through women's perspective. And it was Dr. Amina Wadud who had also become one of the sources of reference because she had done her PhD thesis in terms of how to do this. So it's really about, all this while when it comes to knowledge about Islam, women's rights, we had a lot of it had really come from men in terms of their views and their approach. But reading the text through women's eyes, we do see and read things differently. And so this is how we do what we do. Essentially, we engage with scholars and we realize that, the knowledge, Islam is a very knowledge-centric religion. In fact, the first verse that was revealed to the Prophet is to recite. So that means that we really, the message behind all of that is, we need to have knowledge. We need to embrace knowledge. We need to seek knowledge in order for us to become emancipated and a free person. Essentially, we need to have knowledge. And so there's a lot of engagement throughout the years with various scholars. I'm showing you some of the scholars whom we have engaged before and are still engaged with. This is in relation to Islam and overall understanding of Islam and society. We are also heavily engaged with scholars from Indonesia. As Vivian had mentioned just now, in fact, Indonesia holds the largest population of Muslims in the world. Yeah, And so, it is essential for us to also look at the way they understand Islam, and it's very essential for Malaysia to also look at how Indonesia is doing it, primarily because we have a lot of commonalities. We speak the same language, more or less the same language. The roots of our language are similar. We also, in terms of culture and society, we are also very, very similar. And in a way, the role of women, Vivian had mentioned how, in Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, the role of women, is very much protected and secluded. Whereas for the Southeast Asia communities, women are actually more visible because it was and it still is an agrarian culture. So women participating in economic and livelihood activities is seen and is visible. So in a way, it sometimes perhaps the idea is that it's more egalitarian society than the Muslim society in the Middle East. Engaging in lived realities is really very, very important to us, because we find this is the source of the problems. When you read a religious text that is so disconnected from lived realities, then that text really becomes irrelevant to you and your understanding and meaning, of religion as well as of justice in your lives. That's why for sisters in Islam, we take this approach, let me share with you, of this framework for engagement, analysis, discourse, and advocacy, where current lived realities of women on the ground and their context and their perspectives is very, very important for us in order to understand, and make sure that the Islam that we are practicing and that are in our laws and policies are progressive and that upholds equality, justice, freedom, and dignity. We take a note, that point that Vivian made about, hey, these countries, you're part of the United Nations. And so, we also have that process of holding our government accountable to what they have signed on in terms of international human rights instruments and to what extent they're fulfilling it. And then also looking at, concepts and methodologies in Islamic legal theories, Muslim legal theories, both at the classical and the contemporary perspectives, because at the end of the day, Islam essentially has to support the lived realities and the ideals of equality and justice for women in this century, in our context, in the way we live today, and not the context of Saudi Arabia or the Hijaz. Saudi Arabia wasn't conceptualized, so it was the Hijaz of the 7th century during the Prophet's time. So you'll be getting these slides, so you can go through it. It is a lot, it's overwhelming. I've got 55 here, but I hope when you go through them, they'll give you more or less a certain picture in terms of what we are doing. And for the founding members of Sisters, they said that going through the Quran for themselves and discovering for themselves, the message of, equality and compassion and justice was really a very liberating experience compared to what we have been fed all this while by patriarchal, misogynist messengers of Islam. And the idea is that, it's possible for us to understand Islam in a different way in these ideals that we read about. So how is it that we can make this more publicly known? And so these are some of the strategies that Sisters in Islam had embarked on, in the 1980s. Of course, we have the newspapers, so writing letters to the editor, writing booklets, giving memorandums to the government on the reforms of laws that are discriminatory against women, doing a lot of public education activities. We've also in the beginning, the idea was Sisters in Islam to be just an advocacy group, but in the end, putting out services to women, having a legal service helpline for women to call us in and ask us questions about their rights is also important, and it allows us to collect data and information about what are the challenges that Muslim women are going through during the current times. And of course, building alliances and multiplying voices. There's definitely over 30 years, that CIS has been doing this work. Right now, there are more voices at the group level, at the individual level, at the community level that speak and think in the way that CIS is speaking and thinking, i.e. that, anybody and everybody, essentially, if laws and policies are going to be made in the name of Islam, and the sources are going to be from Islamic sources, but yet, all these policies and laws are going to impact either directly or indirectly on all the citizens of Malaysia, whether they are Muslim or non-Muslim, then everybody has a right to talk about it. So I'm going to end my presentation here. You can have access to the slides, and then I prefer that we have more engagement. I really would not like to take up more time. It's very long, I know, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Rosanna Issa. That was wonderful. We now move to the question and answer portion of our program. If you have not done so already, please put your questions in the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. We do have one question, and I will pose this question to begin. So this question is, are women and men equal in other faiths? So outside of Muslim women, just in other faiths in general, are they equal, is the question they're asking. I think you're muted.
You want to take this on?
You're muted.
Can I lump this with another question that has appeared on Q&A, which asked me to contrast Buddhism and Islam, because I said I grew up in a Chinese Buddhist environment. In fact, in Buddhism, Buddhism has no God, okay? So, but there are certain rules about human relations, and in Buddhism, in Theravada Buddhism is a type of Buddhism. Women are not allowed to be nuns. So women have to be lay volunteers. So in that sense, Buddhism is more gender discriminating than Islam, because in Islam, as Rosanna has pointed out, there's a verse in the Quran that says men and women are equal before God. There is no such thing in Buddhism. I cannot do a broad sweep of Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism and all that. It's be a bit too much to handle in this webinar. I'll have to do some research on that.
Okay. Thank you very much for that fantastic response.
May I add though? I mean,
yes.
Challenge that we face even in Islam, the paradox here is that even though there is a very specific, there are several specific verses in the Quran that talks about the equality between men and women, but the reality of the practice is that, that there is that subordination of women. And it's also, a challenge to deal with this, because there is also a verse in the Quran that talks about, it addresses the issue of guardianship, protection, authority. And the problem we find that with all the laws and policies in most Muslim countries, it really hinges on this one particular verse that was really very contextual. It's a verse that says that men are the providers and protectors of women, and if they have, and therefore they are a degree higher because of what they can provide. And essentially, if in a way, it also talks about how women, wives, owe their obedience to their husbands. And if the wives are not obedient, then the husbands can actually take action to discipline the wife. And so the work of Sisters in Islam and a movement that SIS initiated in 2009 called Musawa, is really about, interrogating this particular verse that underpins the discrimination experienced in reality by Muslim women, and how to engage and read and reinterpret that verse in the context and reality of today, where, women are out there working, if not contributing half, that they're actually the sole breadwinners of the families, holding that 1 degree higher in terms of providing for their families. And therefore, essentially they have a right and the authority to make decisions. So yeah, even though, the text says something, but then, we are still struggling with how do we realize this text in our everyday lives.
Oh, thank you for that fantastic response. That was really eye-opening. And Rosanna, just to follow up with what you said, there's another question again. How can we assist Muslim women in recognizing their rights and standing up for themselves, despite the fact that they may face strong opposition from their communities?
Okay, so I'll start with the fact that, facing opposition from communities, that's par for the course. You're not going to go out there and everybody is going to welcome you with open arms. Some will welcome you with open arms. Some will just say, nope, what you talk about Islam, the way you talk about Islam, we don't agree with it, we disagree, and therefore they will find ways and means to shut your voices down. And I think one of the best ways to recognize their rights and help them stand up for themselves is to open the spaces for them to talk about their lived realities. Because I think lived realities is a way of reaching out to people, and people can find relevance, resonance, and find something that's relatable to all our personal stories. So if you're experiencing, difficulties in terms of relationships, whether it's your husband or your parents, as a daughter, speak out. Just speak out and share your stories. You don't have to approach from it from the perspective of religion, but just share it in terms of your lived realities. And then maybe, open up the spaces to talk about what are your ideals, what do you believe in, and then, those understandings about, talking from the perspectives of what we believe in, our faith, and so on, can come forward. Because I think as people of faith, regardless of whichever faith that we believe in, I think all of us put a lot of hope, that if something goes wrong in our lives, that we can, turn to a higher being and ask for help, and ask for justice, and ask for, some way that we can move, overcome our difficulties and move our ways forward. And I think this is also the entry point then to be able to talk about, my religion says this, but how come I'm not experiencing what my religion says?
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. So this question I'm going to ask Vivian to give a response to. So someone is asking, how much of the practice of patriarchy result from patrilineal, kinship, and inheritance law, and so on, rather than religious text or doctrine? So patriarchy from one angle rather than the religious angle. Yeah.
Right. The patriarchal practices that prevail in any society should be looked at rather than religious doctrine. I have an example. Take female genital mutilation. This happens in many African societies and many societies that claim to be Muslim. Now, I learned that when an ustad was sent to Egypt and found that There is no mention of female genital mutilation anywhere in the Quran. The Ustaz refused to appear on TV to say that this is not Islamic. It's not Islamic, and yet it's justified in the name of Islam. This is an example. So this is actually a custom. So, you know, this, in fact, there are many, many examples of this. For example, there's this mar, which is the mas kawin, which is the personal property of a bride. And this is her personal possession. But then many women are dispossessed of inheritance. The mar is not even given. And that is actually stipulated in the Quran. So things are just being claimed in the name of Islam. So we should look at these as patriarchal societies that are justifying patriarchy in the name of Islam.
Thank you very much for that. And Rosanna, can you respond to this one? Someone is asking for a recommendation, for films that give an accurate idea of gender in specific Islamic majority societies.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think films are always the best way to go, isn't it? Then you can really, really learn a lot about the context as well as the struggles and challenges. I think one of the films, a documentary by Professor Dr. Ziba Mir Husseini, she had done an award-winning, a BAFTA award-winning documentary on divorce, Iranian style. So she's an anthropologist, a scholar in terms of her background, and her struggle really was to see what is happening in the courts in Iran, and how women were able or not to get justice for the issues that they're going to court for. I think that is definitely one, for her, it was really a lot of learning experiences, very eye-opening, and how, Iranian women are really, very engaging, very fiery, and also very courageous, because, they're standing up there in court and challenging the judges, but just by themselves. And I think that's a very awe-inspiring movie. Documentary. I think there are others as well, based in, I think, Iran. There's Kandahar, there's quite a few movies. I'm more kind of familiar and engaged with movies that's in my context, because that's where the struggle is. And there are actually lots of films, from Indonesia as well. One called Berbagi Suami, or The Sharing of Husbands, and it tackles the issue of polygamy. I'm not quite sure to what extent, they would have subtitles, but really, some of the movies that are really contextual. And I guess it's important as well to look at it, from the various contexts. I'm sure the experiences, gone through by women in Afghanistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, they're all very different. And you can see, through our cultural experiences, though they may be different, but somehow that patriarchy, is actually, it cuts across the board, and it affects, issues in our lives, in a very similar way. Domestic violence, inheritance. I mean, that is something that's really very critical. In some contexts, I think some women, even though they have the means to, but they aren't able to get, the minimum rights that's afforded to them in the Quran. In the context of Malaysia, though, there's recognition that yes, women are entitled to inheritance, but then, there is a very, very strict application of that Quranic text, without them, without people being able to see that really this is just the minimum. The minimum is, maybe very little for women, but actually, you can go to as much as equal to, or even more than the share that the men get. But again, this is a struggle for all of us. And I think even with Morocco, that had what do you call this, reform their laws, their family laws, to recognize equality between men and women. When it came to the issue of inheritance, though, they were not able to make that, to have that recognition for that equality. So they were still, and they still are, pushing and challenging for that reform for inheritance.
That's a great response. Thank you for that. Vivian, if you would answer this, that would be lovely. What is the position of Islam regarding the sexual distribution of labor? And how is care work gendered and not according to Islamic doctrine?
Okay, this is very interesting because the concept of care work was not even in the Quran. Okay, I mean, it's not there because we're looking at a 7th century context. Okay, so this is actually a process, a movement that is going on now. That is understanding what is the context in which Prophet Muhammad lived, and what are the different contexts that different Muslims have lived in their lives, including their customs, their laws, and their society and their culture. So this term care work is in fact a new term. I mean, it's a 21st century term. I mean, looking after the aged, looking after the disabled, looking after children. This is not even hitting one's consciousness until the 21st century. I mean, even the 20th century, we didn't even find so much discussion on care work. So the gender division of labor has to be understood in this context. And this context is very important in understanding why the Prophet married 9 women in the last 10 years of his life, because these were women who had been widowed or who were captives of the war with pagan Mecca. And at that time, it was difficult for a woman who was widowed to make a living. So he married them to provide them with a living. So, how can we look at that 7th century context and transport it to the 21st century?
Yeah, it's not, you can't do that, obviously. Yeah. Thank you so much for that response. That's really, really brilliant. Does anyone have any additional questions you can put in the chat? Otherwise, I did have one question for Rosanna, and I was just wondering, do you find in the course of your work that what you do is more, will I say, appealing to the younger generation and the older generation? And the whole idea of Islamic feminism, do younger people find it, do you find that you draw in a younger crowd than an older crowd? And how do you get buy-in from people that are, that feel this is my lot in life, I can't change it, this is where I am, this is where I'll always be? How do you break through some of those barriers?
That's a great question, Oniche, because we would think that, the cis work would be appealing to younger people, but actually, in the context of Malaysia today, we are experiencing religious conservatism in a way that is really different from what we experienced 30 years ago. And this has partly to do with the reality that 30 years ago, as I mentioned, we had a political party that's pushing for the Islamic State, that's pushing for the hudud laws. And so, it was a political project, but that political project is something that grew in society, partly because moderate political parties were trying to win the majority Muslim votes. And so they began this race of out-Islamizing each other. And when we say out-Islamizing, they took the route of, the party that is more conservative, that is more punitive in its approach towards society, towards women, towards punishment. That seems to become the more authentic Islam than, Islam that we have in our vision and ideals. And on top of that, we also experience, a movement where our education system, was very much mired with this whole way of not raising questions. You don't raise questions to your teachers. You only follow, what your teachers say. You don't, that whole cultural thing about questioning the elderly, is also something that's quite strong. And so in the end, 30, 40 years later, what we are experiencing, with, generations of students, of people, of citizens in Malaysia who no longer question, and then, the more authoritative understanding of Islam, that's already embedded through all of these ways and means. There is actually a high resistance to the work that we are doing. But it is still getting somewhere. I wouldn't say that we've lost all hope. If anything, we are targeting the youth, and we are actually targeting the youth from religious backgrounds, who have studied religion, who have in a way understood, Islam to be a very emancipatory religion, but their perspectives on gender and women's rights is still, quite conservative. I also would like to share that the work of Sisters in Islam has undergone scrutiny by the religious authorities. And so we have a religious edict or a fatwa that was issued against us in 2014, saying that we are deviants for subscribing to liberalism and religious pluralism. And so we are actually in our 9th year going through a court process to say that, the fatwa essentially contradicts and contravenes and is against our own federal constitution that allows us to be able to speak. Essentially, we see this as an issue of freedom of expression, because what they're trying to do is to silence our voices through this fatwa.
Oh, thank you so much for that response. Really appreciate that. And I can see that we're 3 minutes past our time here, but I just want to say thank you so much. We sincerely thank you, Vivian and Rosanna Issa, for raising our awareness to Islamic feminism and women's rights. Once again, the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies and Iowa City Foreign Relations Council would like to thank all our co-sponsors and collaborators for making this event possible in observance of International Women's Day. For those interested in more programming, the ICFRC invites you to attend our next program on Wednesday, March 15th, which features speaker Shu Wan, a UI graduate and current PhD student at the University of Buffalo. His talk, We Were Ever Here, Chinese exchange students in Iowa, 1909 to 1937, will begin at 12 noon Central Standard Time via Zoom. More information can be found at icfrc.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are adjourned.